the Surgeon General just issued a warning about loneliness, saying that it has the same health effects as smoking tobacco. Is that something we should be concerned about? We're going to talk about that next on the Celebrate Kids podcast.
Don't be afraid of the dark. Be careful with stars. Not every light is gonna guide you, baby. Not every light is gonna guide you.
Caring for kids today is incredibly challenging. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that we know a lot about our kids. We know what their browser history is on their social media. We know who their friends are. We spend time with them in these different settings. And in all of this, we also get put onto us the dynamics of what it looks like to be a society that is so interconnected, because we have all kinds of studies that tell us how students are doing and what homework they're into and what essential oils they should be taking when they have a headache. There are just so many things that factor in to what parents should feel and know about their kids. And now there's a new warning from the Surgeon General that says that loneliness may be one of the biggest things that parents should be mindful of. But in all of this, there's this simple truth that maybe loneliness shows us that we are never alone. That's something that we're going to talk about today in our Celebrate Kids podcast daily segment, Facing the Dark. Dr. Kathy has some great insights for us as parents and people that care for kids on how we can step forward with confidence into dark moments, especially lonely moments, and not lose heart. So let's turn now to Dr. Kathy Cook. So, Dr. Kathy, according to a new report from the U.S. Surgeon General's office, teens today are lacking social connections, and that can, quote, increase the risk of premature death to levels comparable to smoking daily, end quote. Loneliness increases the risk of premature death by nearly 30%, they've found. And that also elevates our risk of stroke and heart disease and depression and anxiety and even things like dementia. Technology is making the problem worse. People who use social media for 2 hours or more daily are more than twice as likely to report feeling isolated than those who are on such apps for less than 30 minutes a day. So, Dr. Kathy, I think this is kind of an interesting study to come out of the Surgeon General's office. For most of society, this is the arm of government that might be best known for erasing Joe Camel and the push to popularize smoking. It seems like there's now kind of this push to depopularize social media. Is loneliness really worse than smoking? I mean, don't worry, I'm not choosing one over the other for my kids. I'm not going to tell them that they should pick up smoking now to avoid loneliness or anything like that. But I'm just wondering if there is a reality in being lonely that is part of the human experience where smoking wouldn't necessarily have the same thing said about it. What do you think? What are your thoughts there?
I am fascinated by this. Fascinated. And back to what you said, first of all, about the Surgeon General's office erasing Joe Camel. Smoking went way down when smoking was taken out of our TV shows and our movies. I don't have that stat in front of me, but it's true that it decreased dramatically. There's, I think for the same thing, liquor and drinking decreased as our shows and our movies are showing it less. And some of us have joked about, wouldn't it be amazing if shows began showing cell phones less, if, characters weren't constantly on their devices in our movies and our shows, would that even filter down to us? So that whole thing fascinates me. But I just wanted to put that out there because, the model matters, right? What do you let your kids see and what are we watching? Therefore, we think this is normal and we think this is good. And we have to be careful of that. Is loneliness as dangerous as smoking? That's fascinating. Loneliness is a part of our existence. You're absolutely right. And I think we need to teach children, teenagers, and young adults how to handle it, not how to avoid it. It's a fact of life, just like boredom is a fact of life. And if we try to avoid loneliness all the time, we might connect with unhealthy people just because that person's better than no person at all. And that's really not fair. And I also want to say, and I say this with respect for our listeners, being alone is not the same thing as being lonely. You can be alone and not be lonely because you know that you are connected to people and you can reach out. And certainly the God of the Bible, the Holy Spirit, that's certainly one that I'm thinking about. But there's also any number of people, of course, that we can reach out to in those times when we are alone. So we have to be careful of that. One more thing, if you're not comfortable with your own thoughts, being lonely is very discouraging. So if you are struggling with loneliness as you listen to me, or you have kids who are struggling with loneliness, change their thought life, help them be optimistic, help them be positive, help them know what they do well and not just what they don't do well. Because if all you know are negatives about yourself and the culture and, anything else you're involved in, then being alone with your own thoughts is discouraging. Make sure they know true things that they can reflect on and think about so that when they're alone, they don't necessarily have to be discouraged.
Dr. Kathy, that kind of goes to this fact that I found this article a couple weeks ago from a Christian who talked about being lonely as a kid, but she had this phrase where she was lonely, but she was never alone. Her idea was that, kind of loneliness will strike us. But when we're grounded in God's word, she found that we realize that we're never alone. And I'd love to hear you kind of speak to this. Is the loneliness craze just one of those, I like to call it kind of C.S. Lewis moments, where God kind of whispers to us in our pleasures or our successes, but he really shouts to us in our pain? Should we be leaning into loneliness rather than avoiding it? What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, like I said, I don't think it's realistic to avoid it all the time. So accepting some times of being alone, that's totally appropriate. Otherwise, you use people and you'll be insecure and have a lack of confidence. And what will you do the day that you get a job and you're in a cubicle all day by yourself, or you work at home and you're just going to be so distracted and depressed by that? So we have to learn to handle the loneliness. Can we lean into it and see it as good? I would hope so. It is harder for extroverts. If you have an extroverted personality, then you get energy from people. And so if you are working alone or you're schooling alone or you're, whatever, then you need to really make sure you reach out. Maybe on your lunch break, you call a good friend, you FaceTime your mom, you make sure that you have an interjection of people contact, if you will, because that's fair. That's what you need to know about yourself. So I think it's both. Avoid it if you can. I mean, if you're isolating because you're unfriendly, change your character. If you're isolating because people have disappointed you and you're afraid to risk friendship again, I get that. Pray that you'll discern who is someone you could enjoy spending some time with, and trust again and risk again and learn to be resilient.
Yeah, I love that. I'd like to hear you kind of maybe close with this idea. I know that you've talked a lot about resiliency. So what in your study of resiliency have you found to help kind of kids build resiliency so that loneliness doesn't drive us to a place of despondency or maybe even kind of feeling like we're alone? How can we build that resiliency inside of our kids?
Yeah, it is interesting. Certainly, resiliency, choosing to try again after difficulty. Resiliency is coming back from despair, disappointment, grief, fear. And it's a choice. And if you make that choice often enough, it can become a part of your character so that you don't even think about it. It's just a natural way that you bounce back and come back from the difficult things that happen in life, because life is difficult today. So for things like loneliness and relationships, it's again discerning who's on my side. I think discerning the difference between someone who is consistently irresponsible and someone who rarely is, right? Like if there's somebody who consistently gossips, I will step away from that relationship. If there's someone who is consistently kind and on my side and has integrity, and I find out that she gossiped, I'm not going to give up on that person. I'm going to assume that there was a bad day, there was a bad circumstance, because I'll admit that sometimes happens with me, even though I would not be known as having that negative quality about myself. So I think we discern consistent behavior fault versus an occasional character challenge that happened because of the circumstances. I'm not saying it's right, just saying it's different. Do you know yourself well enough to know who might want to be your friend? Do you know that you're a band geek? So you ask the question at a gathering, hey, did you ever, do you play any instruments? Do you enjoy worship at church? If you know that you enjoy C.S. Lewis, perhaps you're at a church function, you're joining a small group and you say, hey, do you guys like to read? I've really enjoyed the C.S. Lewis books. And you see if you can find somebody who you have something in common with. So I think a lot of resiliency related to loneliness is actually knowing yourself well, which allows you to then find others who you might specifically enjoy hanging out with.
I really appreciate how Dr. Kathy closes us here, because she talks about the need for us to understand when we're lonely or feeling alone, and how that's linked to us also fully knowing ourselves. And that phrase, fully knowing, is something that sparked a remembrance for me in some Bible memory that I'd done in high school. And it comes out of Paul's letter to the Corinthian church in chapter 13, the love chapter. And we're going to begin reading at verse 8. And this is what Paul writes. Love never fails. But where there are prophecies, they will cease. And where there are tongues, they will be stilled. And where there is knowledge, it will pass away. For we know in part, and we prophesy in part. But when completeness comes, what is in part disappears. Because when I was a child, I thought like a child and I reasoned like a child. But when I became a man, I put childish ways behind me. For now we see only a reflection as in a mirror, and then we shall see face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall know fully, even as I am fully known. And then Paul closes this chapter saying, and now these three remain, faith, hope, and love. But the greatest of these is love. And I think what Paul is saying here in this passage is that we only see but a dim reflection of what is actually going on in these moments. But when we come to understand the love, the true love that comes from Jesus, we start to see in a more full picture. And then we shall know fully because we are being fully known. And I think that's an amazing truth. To the extent that God knows us, we will also know God. We should take heart that He fully knows us, that He made us fearfully and wonderfully, and that He sees us, and that He knows our pain, and He knows our hopes, and He knows our dreams. He knows our fears and our future. He knows every hair on our head, and He knows so much about Himself that He reveals it to us. And that, I think, is a bright light in a dark moment, to realize that God fully knows us, and that as we want to understand and fully know ourselves, we can spend time understanding and diving in to the greatness of God, and that reveals truths about ourselves at the same time. And that gives us hope for what Dr. Kathy is talking about, where when we feel lonely, maybe we need to take a step back and know more about ourselves, which what Paul is saying is we need to spend time then knowing God. That's something that I think we can guide the kids that we care for to do in unique and powerful ways by simply just sharing with them who we understand God to be. That can give them encouragement and hope in dark moments and times where they feel lonely. And so we hope that this podcast has been an encouragement for you today. On behalf of us all here at the Celebrate Kids team, I want to say thanks for listening, and we're looking forward to seeing you here again tomorrow.